My husband called during the funeral of my mother and screamed through the speakerphone for me to put him first. He demanded I leave the cemetery immediately to manage the caterers at his family gala. When my grieving father heard my mother-in-law shouting insults in the background, he did not cry. He took my phone, his hand perfectly steady, and told my husband we would be there in an hour. Then he turned to me and said we were going to give them exactly what they asked for. What happened next destroyed their high society empire. My name is Catlin. I am 33 years old and I work as a financial auditor in Chicago. On a freezing Tuesday afternoon, I stood shivering under a black umbrella, watching the cemetery workers prepare to lower my mother into the ground. Her name was Linda. She ran a local hardware store for 30 years, building a life of quiet stability for my father and me. Now she was gone. The icy wind whipping off Lake Michigan felt like a physical blow against my face. My father, William, stood beside me. He was 64 years old, a man of few words and deep loyalties. His hand gripped my arm with a desperate strength, his knuckles white against the dark fabric of his coat. We had spent the last 3 days in a fog of arrangements and tearful condolences, navigating a world that suddenly felt entirely empty. I could barely comprehend that she was actually gone forever. The reality of her sudden passing had left me feeling completely numb and profoundly isolated from everyone else. I just wanted to wake up from this nightmare. The priest stood at the head of the grave, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the driving rain. He was delivering the final blessing, speaking of peace and eternal rest. The small gathering of mourners bowed their heads. Most of them were longtime customers and neighbors, working-class people who had known my mother for decades. They stood in the mud and the cold out of genuine respect. Noticeably absent was my husband Gavin and his entire family. Gavin had claimed that a critical investor meeting prevented him from attending the service. I had accepted his excuse without argument. I needed to mourn my mother in peace without worrying about managing his temper or catering to his mother Beatrice and her endless judgments about our background. The priest bowed his head and raised his hand to make the sign of the cross. The silence in the cemetery was absolute, broken only by the steady drum of rain against the umbrellas. Then a sound shattered the quiet. It was a loud, upbeat pop song blaring at maximum volume. It took me 3 seconds to realize the sound was coming from my own coat pocket. Panic seized my chest. I frantically dug my freezing, numb fingers into my pocket to silence the intrusive noise. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking so badly that the device slipped. As I fumbled to catch it before it hit the mud, my thumb swiped across the screen. I accidentally hit the speaker button. Gavin did not say hello. He did not ask how the service was going. His voice boomed out of the small speaker, echoing loudly across the silent mourning crowd. I do not care if they are lowering the casket right now, Caitlin. Put me before your mother for once. The sheer volume and hostility of his words made several people gasp. I stood paralyzed, staring at the phone in my hand, as if it were a venomous snake. The head of my father snapped up, his tear-filled eyes widening in shock. Gavin did not pause for a response. He continued his tirade, his tone dripping with arrogant entitlement. My family anniversary gala starts in an hour. My parents are furious that you are not here managing the caterers. I need you here fixing this right now. I felt the color drain from my face. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Gavin, I whispered, my voice trembling with profound grief and utter disbelief. Please stop. We are at the cemetery. The priest is giving the final prayer right now. I am burying my mother. I expected a moment of realization, perhaps a hasty apology. Instead, Gavin scoffed loudly. Stop being so melodramatic, Caitlin, he snapped at me. Your wallowing is embarrassing me. I have major investors arriving tonight, people who are going to fund my new high-rise project. You need to show up in 60 minutes and do your job as my wife, or do not bother coming home at all. Before I could process the cruelty of his ultimatum, another voice pierced through the speaker. It was Beatrice, my mother-in-law. She was shouting in the background, ensuring her words were loud enough for me to hear. Tell her if she does not respect our family social standing, she is out, Beatrice yelled. Her voice was shrill and laced with venom. We never should have let you marry the daughter of a blue-collar hardware store owner. Her roots are showing, Gavin. She has absolutely no class. The words hung in the freezing air, toxic and devastating. I looked around the cemetery. The people who had loved my mother, who respected her hard work and decent life, were staring at the phone with expressions of pure horror. I felt a deep, suffocating shame wash over me. For years I had endured the subtle digs of Beatrice about my upbringing. I had tolerated the dismissive attitude of Gavin toward my career as a financial auditor, always prioritizing his real estate ventures over my steady work. I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. Now, at the edge of the grave of my mother, their true colors were exposed. The disrespect was so absolute it literally took my breath away. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Beside me, I felt a sudden shift in the energy of my father. William had been quietly weeping moments before his shoulders bowed under the weight of losing his life partner. But as the insulting words of Beatrice echoed through the rain, his sorrow vanished. It hardened. I turned to look at him and saw a man I barely recognized. His grief had transformed into a cold, terrifying anger. His posture straightened and his jaw set like stone. He simply reached out and gently took the phone from my trembling hands. My father held the device up to his face. The wind whipped his gray hair around his forehead, but his eyes were perfectly calm. "We will be there in an hour, Gavin," he said, his voice quiet and dangerously even. He did not wait for a reply. He pressed the red button ending the call. The silence returned to the cemetery, heavy and expectant. My father slipped the phone into his pocket and turned to face me. He reached out and brushed a stray tear from my cold cheek. "Wipe your tears, Caitlin," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. "They want you to put their high society party before your mother. So let us go to their party. Let us give them exactly what they want. And we will show them exactly what kind of people they are dealing with." The drive from the cemetery to the downtown hotel took less than 40 minutes. I sat in the passenger seat of my father's truck, staring out the window at the gray city streets blurring past. The heater blasted warm air over our freezing damp clothes, but the chill had settled deep into my bones. My father kept his hands steady on the steering wheel. He did not speak, but his silence was no longer the heavy weight of grief. It was the sharp, calculated quiet of a man who had made a final decision. I was walking into the most elite real estate networking event of the year, looking exactly like a woman who had just buried her mother. We pulled up to the grand entrance of the luxury hotel. My father parked his battered pickup truck right behind a sleek silver sports car. The valet looked confused, glancing from the truck to our somber attire, but my father simply handed him the keys with a firm nod. We walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into a lobby flooded with golden light from massive crystal chandeliers. Taking a deep breath, I walked into the room with my father right beside me. The contrast was jarring. The room was a sea of glittering evening gowns, tailored silk suits, and flawless smiles. We were a dark, muddy stain on their perfect aesthetic canvas. It did not take long for people to notice us. I kept my chin high, remembering the words of my father. We were giving them exactly what they asked for. I could feel the weight of their judgmental stares pressing down on my shoulders, but I refused to let it break my resolve. Every step I took across that pristine marble floor was a testament to the enduring strength my mother had instilled within me. Then I saw Gavin. His eyes locked onto mine. The charming smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. His face was flushed with anger. He did not greet me. Instead, he reached out and aggressively grabbed my wrist. His fingers dug painfully into my skin as he yanked me toward the heavy wooden doors leading to a private side hallway. As soon as the hallway doors closed behind us, Gavin dropped his voice into a furious, venomous whisper. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded, his face inches from mine. "Are you intentionally trying to sabotage me? You look like you crawled out of a swamp." I looked down at his hand still gripping my wrist. "Let go of me, Gavin," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest. "You demanded I come here. You screamed at me over the phone while the priest was delivering the final blessing for my mother. We followed your exact instructions." Gavin released my wrist with a disgusted sigh. "Do you have any idea how crucial tonight is? I have 3 different private equity partners in that room evaluating my new high-rise project. My entire reputation is on the line, and you show up looking like a depressing charity case. My father took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. Gavin sneered, turning his anger toward my father. I do not need lectures from a man who spent his life selling hammers and nails. This is the real world, William. This is high net worth business. If Caitlin cannot handle the pressure of being a supportive wife to a successful developer, maybe she does not belong in this family. Before I could respond to his staggering cruelty, the hallway doors swung open again. It was Ashley, the sister of Gavin. She stepped into the quiet corridor holding a full glass of red wine. She wore a stunning emerald green gown and a mocking smile that perfectly matched the arrogance of her brother. I thought I smelled wet dog in the ballroom, Ashley said, looking me up and down with exaggerated disgust. She took a sip of her wine and shook her head. You never did fit in with us, Caitlin. We tried to polish you up. We tried to teach you how to exist in a high net worth family. But I guess you can never truly wash off that blue-collar hardware store dirt. You have no right to speak about her family that way. My father said, his voice rising just enough to echo in the hallway. Linda worked harder in one day than you have worked in your entire life. Ashley let out a sharp, condescending laugh. Please, your wife sold light bulbs to suburban housewives. My family builds skylines. We shape the economy. With a swift, deliberate flick of her wrist, Ashley tilted her glass forward. The dark red wine cascaded out, splashing directly onto the chest of the black morning coat of my father. The stain spread rapidly across the fabric, mimicking a bleeding wound. Oh my goodness, Ashley gasped in a tone dripping with fake innocence. I am so terribly clumsy. I guess you really do need to leave now to go wash up. Such a shame. He simply looked down at the dark red stain on his coat, and then looked back up at Ashley with a terrifyingly calm expression. Gavin stepped between us, puffing out his chest. You need to leave my event right now, William, Gavin ordered, pointing toward the exit doors at the end of the hall. This gala is for actual contributors to society, people who build wealth. We do not need your depressing presence ruining our celebration. Get out. I looked at the man I had married, the man I had supported through his early career struggles, the man I had loved. In that moment, the last remaining thread of affection I held for him snapped completely. There was nothing left but cold clarity. My father did not argue. He calmly reached up and buttoned his stained coat over his chest. He turned to me, his eyes softening as he looked at my face. He leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to my cheek. Stay strong, Caitlin, he whispered quietly. I love you. I will see you at home. He turned around and walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the exit. He pushed through the glass doors and stepped back out into the freezing Chicago rain. I watched him go, feeling a profound sense of pride in his quiet dignity. I turned back to face my husband and his sister, my expression entirely blank. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully humiliated us and put us back in our place. Outside in the pouring rain, my father walked steadily toward his battered pickup truck. He did not bother opening his umbrella. He reached the truck, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. The interior was cold and dark. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for David, the senior corporate attorney for the estate. He pressed call and held the phone to his ear. It rang twice before the lawyer answered. David, my father, said, his voice hard and resolute as he stared at the glowing lights of the luxury hotel through his rain-streaked windshield. It is time to unlock the blind trust of Linda. We are activating Caitlin as the sole executor. We need to begin immediately. The oak doors of the hotel lobby swung shut behind me, muting the sounds of clinking crystal and forced laughter. I stood under the awning, letting the freezing rain mist against my face. I did not shed a single tear. The deep sorrow of losing my mother had been temporarily overshadowed by a cold, burning clarity. I hailed a taxicab and gave the driver the address to the suburban house Gavin and I shared. The ride was completely silent. I watched the bright city lights blur against the wet glass. Gavin had chosen his elite investors over my grief. He had allowed his sister to humiliate my father. There was absolutely no coming back from that terrible betrayal. When I finally unlocked the heavy front door, the house felt entirely different. It was no longer a shared sanctuary. It was just a building filled with expensive furniture I never even liked. I walked up the wooden staircase, the silence broken only by the sound of drawers opening and shutting aggressively in the master bedroom. I pushed the door open. Gavin was standing by the closet, frantically tossing designer shirts and tailored suit jackets into a large leather suitcase. I did not look guilty when he saw me. He just sighed heavily and continued packing. "What are you doing, Gavin?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "I am going to a hotel," he replied, not looking at me as he zipped a toiletry bag. "I cannot be around you right now, Catelyn. Your depressing energy is completely toxic to my mindset. I am in the middle of closing the most important real estate deal of my career, and you are dragging me down with this constant wallowing." I stepped further into the room, staring at the man I had married. "My mother died 3 days ago," I stated slowly, enunciating each word so the reality of his callousness might actually register. "I am not wallowing. I am grieving." Gavin rolled his eyes and tossed the toiletry bag into his suitcase. "Everyone loses parents, Caitlin. It is a part of life. You do not see me staging dramatic walkouts at my own family anniversary gala. You completely humiliated me tonight in front of men who control billions of dollars in private equity. You and your father walking in there looking like gravediggers was a calculated move to ruin my image. I need space from your negativity before it infects my project." I stood my ground, my arms crossed over my damp black coat. "Then go to a hotel," I said firmly. "Take as much space as you need. I will not stop you." He paused, his hands resting on the handle of his suitcase. He looked directly at me, his expression shifting from irritation to a calculating, manipulative calmness. "Since we are having an honest conversation about moving forward, there is a minor logistical issue we need to handle tonight," he said smoothly. "My high-rise development project has hit a slight delay with the municipal permits. It has created a temporary cash flow shortfall for the preliminary contractor payouts. I need you to transfer the life insurance payout your mother left you into my business account." I stared at him, genuinely wondering if I had misheard. "You want the life insurance money from my dead mother?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "The woman you just allowed your sister to insult. The woman whose funeral you refused to attend. It is a temporary transfer." He snapped, his patience evaporating instantly. "It is barely $50,000, Caitlin. That is pocket change in my world, but it will cover the gap until my institutional funding clears next week. Consider it an investment in our future. You owe me for ruining my networking opportunities tonight. I am not giving you a single dime of the money of my mother," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "You can ask your high net worth family to cover your shortfall." The mask of the charming, successful developer dropped, revealing the vicious, petty man beneath. The face of Gavin turned red with fury. He dropped the handle of his suitcase and pulled his smartphone from his pocket. "Fine," he sneered, tapping aggressively on his screen. "If you want to play hardball, we can play hardball. Let us see how independent you feel when you remember who actually funds your lifestyle." I watched in silence as he logged into his banking application. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I am protecting my assets from a vindictive, unstable woman," he declared. With a few swift swipes, he began executing transfers. "I am draining every single joint account we share. Your access to the checking account is gone. The savings account is empty. I am freezing the credit cards attached to my name, which happens to be all of them." My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and watched the automated bank alerts flood my screen. "Account frozen, balance zero, transfer completed." He was systematically cutting off my access to every dollar we had shared during our 5-year marriage. "You cannot just take everything, Gavin," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level despite the sudden financial guillotine dropping on my neck. "My salary goes into those accounts too. Your auditor's salary is a rounding error compared to what I bring in," he mocked, shoving his phone back into his pocket. "I make quadruple your salary on paper. You have contributed nothing of real value to this marriage or this house. You have exactly zero liquid cash right now, Caitlin. Let us see how long your stubborn pride lasts when you realize you cannot even buy a cup of coffee. You will be crawling back to me begging for grocery money by the weekend. And maybe then you will learn to respect your place in this family." He grabbed his suitcase, shouldered his way past me, and walked heavily down the stairs. The front door slammed shut, echoing through the empty house. I stood alone in the master bedroom, stripped of my financial safety net. But Gavin had severely underestimated me. I did not cry. I simply walked over to my closet, pulled out a small duffel bag, and began packing my own clothes. 30 minutes later, I locked the front door of the house and drove straight to the modest home of my father. The porch light was on, cutting a warm yellow path through the freezing rain. When I walked inside, William was waiting for me. He was sitting quietly at the worn wooden kitchen table. He had brewed a fresh pot of hot coffee, 2 mugs already set out. "I have nothing, Dad," I said softly, dropping my duffel bag by the door. Gavin drained the accounts. He froze the cards. "I do not have a single dollar to my name." William did not look worried. He simply gestured for me to sit down across from him. Between the 2 coffee mugs sat a heavy leather-bound ledger. It looked ancient, its corners worn soft from decades of handling. My father placed his large, calloused hand flat against the leather cover and pushed it across the table toward me. "Your mother did not just run a hardware store, Caitlin," he said, his voice carrying a quiet power that sent a shiver down my spine. "She owned the land it sat on, and half the commercial blocks in the district." I looked down at the heavy leather-bound ledger resting on the scratched wooden surface of our kitchen table. The pages inside were filled with meticulous handwritten columns, rows of property addresses, acquisition dates, and rental yields. "Your mother was a brilliant woman, Caitlin." William said, his voice thick with a mixture of immense pride and lingering sorrow. "She saw the potential in this city long before the major developers started sweeping through the neighborhoods. Whenever the hardware store turned a profit, she did not buy expensive clothes or fancy cars. She bought distressed commercial spaces and held on to them. Over the course of 30 years, she quietly amassed a fortune." I traced my finger over a column of numbers. It was generational wealth, the kind of money that Gavin and his pretentious family constantly pretended to possess. "Why did she never tell me?" I asked. "She wanted you to build your own character first," my father explained. "She wanted you to value hard work and understand the value of a dollar earned through your own sweat. She set up an anonymous holding company to manage the properties and the investments so her identity would remain completely hidden from the public eye. And she named you as the sole heir and the sole executor of the entire estate." I sat back in my chair, the sheer magnitude of the revelation washing over me. I was not a financially stranded wife. I was the head of a massive commercial real estate portfolio. I looked at my father, and for the first time since my mother passed away, I felt a genuine spark of life ignite inside my chest. "Show me the rest of it," I said, pulling the ledger closer. We spent the next 2 hours poring over the documents. My father explained the structure of the holding company, the property management firms they employed to handle the day-to-day operations, and the various investment portfolios. As a financial auditor, tracing money through labyrinthine channels was my daily life. Looking at her immaculate bookkeeping, I felt a profound connection to her. My mother had not just been buying land. She had been funneling her profits into high-yield private equity funds, acting as a silent heavyweight limited partner across multiple commercial sectors. She had built an absolute fortress of financial security. I turned to the section detailing the private equity investments. My eyes scanned down a list of corporate entities and high-profile fund managers. I read through the names, noting the percentages of ownership. Then I stopped. My finger hovered over a specific line item printed neatly near the bottom of the page. I felt the blood turn to ice in my veins. I leaned closer to the page to make absolutely sure I was reading correctly. The name was burned into my memory from my husband endlessly bragging about his elite connections. "Dad," I said, my voice suddenly very tight, "look at this holding. Look at the primary beneficiary of this specific private equity group." My father leaned over the table, adjusting his reading glasses. He squinted at the line. "Vanguard Horizon Partners," he read aloud. "Yes, she invested heavily with them 5 years ago. They pool investor money to fund major architectural projects downtown." I felt a cold smile slowly spread across my face. Vanguard Horizon Partners is the exact private equity group acting as the primary financier for the new high-rise project of Gavin. My father froze. He looked from the ledger to my face, the realization hitting him. "You mean to tell me?" he started. "Gavin has been bragging for 6 months about the elite high net worth investors backing his multi-million-dollar luxury condominium project." I explained the pieces of the puzzle snapping into perfect clarity. His entire reputation and the social standing of Beatrice are completely leveraged on this single development. If this project fails, his company goes bankrupt. His family loses everything. I looked back down at the ledger, my mind working at lightning speed. Gavin thinks he answers to a board of faceless billionaires. He has absolutely no idea that the primary backer of the Vanguard Horizon Partners Fund is an anonymous holding company created by the woman he just insulted. He does not know that the blue-collar hardware store money he mocked tonight is the only thing keeping his company afloat. My father leaned back in his chair, a look of profound satisfaction settling over his weathered features. "Well, I will be damned," he whispered softly. Linda always did have a flawless sense of timing. The reality of my position settled over me like a heavy protective cloak. A few hours ago, Gavin had stood in our bedroom and laughed at me. He had drained my checking account and frozen my credit cards, convinced that he held all the power. He had told me I would be crawling back to him, begging for grocery money. He had kicked my grieving father out of a gala to protect his pristine image. But Gavin was not the one holding the power. I was not just his discarded, financially stranded wife. By the rules of the trust my mother had established, I was effectively his biggest creditor. I owned the debt that controlled his future. I closed the ledger and let my hands rest flat on the leather cover. The grief that had been suffocating me was still there, but it had transformed. It was no longer a heavy, paralyzing weight. It was a sharp, focused energy. I thought about Beatrice screaming about my lack of class. I thought about Ashley intentionally pouring red wine on the coat of my father. I thought about Gavin demanding I put his networking event before the funeral of my mother. They wanted to play high-stakes business. They wanted to worship at the altar of wealth and status. I was going to show them exactly how the game was played. "Where is the contact information for the corporate attorney who manages the estate?" I asked my father. William opened a small drawer in the kitchen table and pulled out a pristine cream-colored business card. He slid it across the table toward me. "His name is David. He has been handling the legal framework for your mother for over a decade. He is expecting your call." I picked up my personal smartphone. I looked at the screen, noting the multiple missed alerts from the bank accounts Gavin had drained. I swiped the notifications away and dialed the number on the business card. The phone rang 3 times before a deep professional voice answered. "David speaking." "Hello there, David," I said, my voice steady, professional, and entirely devoid of fear. "My name is Caitlin. I believe you handled the estate planning for my mother, Linda." There was a brief pause on the line, followed by a respectful shift in his tone. "Yes, Caitlin. I have been waiting for your call. I am deeply sorry for your loss. Your mother was an extraordinary woman and a brilliant client. How can I assist you tonight?" I looked across the kitchen table at my father. He gave me a single affirming nod. I took a deep breath, stepping fully into the legacy my mother had built for me. "I am ready to assume my role as CEO," I said clearly into the phone. "And we need to conduct an immediate, aggressive audit of my husband's development project." David remained completely silent on the other end of the telephone line for a long, heavy moment. When he finally spoke, his deep tone had shifted from the comforting voice of a family friend to the sharp, tactical cadence of a corporate attorney. He told me that he had been carefully preparing for this exact transition for years, simply waiting for the day I would be ready to take the reins. He explained that my mother had structured the holding company with a flawless, seamless succession plan. There would be no probate delays, no inheritance tax freezes, and no public filings that could expose my identity to the press or to my arrogant husband. The transition of executive power would be instantaneous and completely invisible to the outside world. I asked him about Vanguard Horizon Partners and the specific legal clauses governing those private equity investments. David confirmed everything I had suspected from reading the ledger. The holding company was not just a minor participant in the real estate fund. We were the primary anchor investor. My mother had provided the crucial foundational capital that allowed Vanguard to finance the massive luxury high-rise project of Gavin. David warned me that initiating an aggressive financial audit could trigger a catastrophic cascade of consequences for the development firm of my husband. He needed me to understand that this was not a simple warning shot or a minor administrative hurdle. It was a devastating maneuver that could paralyze his entire operation within days. I looked across the kitchen table at my father, who was watching me with a quiet, fierce pride shining in his tired eyes. I told David that paralyzing the operation was exactly the point. Gavin had maliciously locked me out of my own bank accounts, assuming I was entirely dependent on his wealth. He had built his entire arrogant persona on a foundation of money that actually belonged to the family he constantly mocked. I instructed David to draft the necessary paperwork for me to officially assume the role of Chief Executive Officer by morning. I also ordered him to pull every financial disclosure, every municipal permit application, and every single loan covenant tied to the high-rise project. After I ended the call, the deep quiet of the small house settled around us again. The freezing rain continued to beat against the kitchen windows in a steady rhythm. I ran my hands over the worn leather cover of the ledger, feeling the immense physical weight of the legacy my mother had left behind. I asked my father how she managed to hide all of this wealth from everyone for so long. William smiled a soft, nostalgic expression, easing the harsh lines of his weathered face. He told me that Linda never cared about the performative display of money. She despised the exclusive country clubs, the expensive designer clothes, and the shallow networking events that Gavin and his mother Beatrice worshipped. She viewed money as a heavy suit of armor, a way to protect the people she loved from a world that could be endlessly cruel. She always knew that Gavin looked down on us, but she also knew that true power is the loudest when it is completely silent. The next morning, I woke up long before dawn. I had barely slept, my mind racing through endless columns of numbers and complex legal strategies. I showered and dressed in a sharp-tailored gray suit, leaving behind the damp, depressing morning clothes I had worn to the cemetery. When I arrived at the downtown law office of David, the city was just beginning to wake up. His firm occupied the top floor of a sleek, towering glass building, a sharp contrast to the modest hardware store where this incredible wealth had originated. David greeted me in the elegant lobby and escorted me to a large conference room with a sprawling view of the Chicago skyline. He had already prepared a thick stack of complicated documents. We spent 3 hours meticulously going through the intricacies of the anonymous holding company. I reviewed commercial leases, municipal bonds, and the vast network of shell corporations my mother had brilliantly utilized to maintain her complete anonymity. We finally arrived at the Vanguard Horizon Partners portfolio. David slid a detailed financial schematic across the polished mahogany conference table. He explained that Gavin had leveraged absolutely everything to secure this specific funding. His family had put up their own personal assets, their existing commercial properties, and the entire reputation of their firm as collateral. They desperately needed the steady flow of capital from Vanguard to pay their daily contractors, secure their municipal permits, and keep the massive project moving forward. If the anchor investor demanded a sudden comprehensive compliance review, the fund managers at Vanguard would be legally obligated to pause all ongoing disbursements immediately. The essential cash flow of Gavin would evaporate overnight, leaving him scrambling to cover enormous daily expenses. Without that money, the subcontractors would walk off the job site, the union leaders would file grievances, and the city inspectors would halt construction entirely. The illusion of his infinite wealth would shatter, exposing the fragile, over-leveraged reality of his business. I stared at the schematic, tracing the flow of money from my mother directly into the pockets of the people who had treated her memory like trash. It was almost poetic. I picked up a heavy silver pen and began signing my name on the dotted lines. With each signature I executed, I felt the remaining traces of the intimidated, accommodating wife burn away. I was no longer the quiet woman who sat obediently while Beatrice mocked my blue-collar upbringing. I was the architect of their impending financial ruin. I handed the final binding document back to David. I told him to contact the senior fund managers at Vanguard immediately. I was to inform them that the new executive leadership of the holding company required a comprehensive compliance review of their largest outstanding commitment. We were going to demand absolute proof of asset valuation, meticulous contractor receipts, and verified environmental impact studies before another single dollar was released to the firm of my husband. David gathered the signed papers, a small approving smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He promised the official legal notices would be sent out to the fund managers before noon. I thanked him for his loyalty to my mother and left the law office. I walked out onto the bustling Chicago streets, blending in with the morning crowds. The freezing rain had finally stopped, replaced by a cold, biting wind that cleared my head. Somewhere in this city, Gavin was waking up in a luxury hotel suite, fully believing he had successfully discarded me. He probably thought I was sitting in the small kitchen of my father, crying over my frozen credit cards and wondering how I was going to afford basic groceries for the week. He was likely preparing for a day of arrogant boasting, completely certain of his untouchable status. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his expensive leather shoes was already beginning to crumble into dust. I hailed a passing yellow taxicab and gave the driver the exact address to my downtown corporate auditing firm. It was time to go to work. I had numbers to run, financial traps to set, and my arrogant husband had a very difficult, very expensive lesson to learn today about true power. I had barely settled into the back seat of the taxi when my phone began vibrating again. For one irrational second, I expected another automated warning from the bank. Instead, Beatrice's name filled the screen. I considered letting it ring out, but then I remembered what David had told me about letting people reveal themselves when they believed they still held the advantage. I answered and said nothing. Beatrice did not offer condolences. She did not ask whether my father was all right after Ashley deliberately soaked his morning coat in wine. She launched directly into a smug announcement that the family was moving ahead with an exclusive pre-launch reception for Gavin's high-rise. She said the guest list had been tightened after the embarrassment at the gala and made a point of telling me I was strictly banned from attending. According to her, only serious investors, city power brokers, and people who understood the standards of their family would be admitted. I stared through the taxi window at the wet Chicago streets and listened while she bragged about a project that without my mother's money could not make it through another payroll cycle. When Beatrice finally paused to breathe, I asked one simple question. Are the subcontractors still coming to the pre-launch party if they have not been paid? The silence on the other end lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Her voice sharpened immediately. She accused me of spreading malicious rumors and demanded to know what I had done. I told her I had done nothing she needed to worry about if Gavin's books were as strong as he always claimed. Then I ended the call. The satisfaction did not come from insulting her back. It came from hearing the first crack in her certainty. The compliance notice David had sent only hours earlier was already reaching the people who depended on Vanguard's disbursements. Gavin's family could still pour champagne and talk about generational wealth, but the cash beneath the performance had begun to disappear. By the time I reached my auditing firm, the first consequences were visible. David forwarded me copies of 2 notices from major subcontractors requesting written confirmation that overdue invoices would be funded. A concrete supplier had suspended the next delivery pending payment. One mechanical contractor had warned that crews would be reassigned if the development company could not cure the delay within 48 hours. None of those problems meant the project had collapsed yet, but they meant Gavin had lost the one thing his entire operation depended on: uninterrupted cash flow. I did not respond to any of the contractors directly. I was still acting through the holding company and Vanguard's compliance process, and I wanted every move documented. I saved the notices, opened a clean audit file, and waited. I did not have to wait long. Less than an hour later, Gavin called. His first sentence was not an apology. He demanded to know whether I had spoken to anyone at Vanguard. I told him that I was at work and had no interest in discussing his business after the way he treated me at my mother's funeral. His tone changed instantly. The fury disappeared and was replaced by the falsely patient voice he used whenever he wanted something from me. He said the funding pause was a routine misunderstanding, but the timing had created a temporary liquidity problem. He had already found a private lender willing to issue a high-interest bridge loan large enough to cover payroll and critical contractor invoices. There was only one obstacle. The lender wanted an additional personal guarantor with stable income and excellent credit. He wanted me to co-sign. I actually laughed. It was a small sound, but Gavin heard it. His patience snapped. He reminded me that we were still legally married and said a supportive wife would protect the family's future instead of acting vindictive. Then he tried a different tactic. If I signed the loan, he said he would allow me to come back to the house. He would even consider putting money back into the joint checking account once I proved I could behave rationally. The arrogance of the offer was breathtaking. I had emptied accounts containing my own salary walked out while I was grieving, and now he was presenting access to my home and my own money as a reward for helping him assume even more debt. I asked him to send the proposed loan documents in writing. His voice brightened immediately because he mistook documentation for surrender. The email arrived 6 minutes later. I did not sign anything. I forwarded the entire package to David and downloaded a copy into my secured case folder. The proposed bridge loan was expensive enough to make even an aggressive developer hesitate, punishing interest-sweeping default provisions and a personal guarantee that would expose me to losses far beyond the $50,000 Gavin had tried to take from my mother's life insurance. More importantly, the application attached to the lender contained financial representations about Gavin's company that did not match the information Vanguard had on file. I saw differences in asset values, debt balances, and projected rental income before I even began a formal comparison. Gavin had just handed a financial auditor a second version of his own story. A text message appeared while I was still reviewing the attachments. Gavin wrote, "Sign it today, and I will tell security at the house you are allowed back in." Beneath the sentence was another message telling me not to make this difficult. I looked at the screen for several seconds, then sent a single thumbs-up emoji. It was the smallest response I had ever given him, and he interpreted it exactly the way I hoped he would. He replied with a triumphant message telling me I was finally being sensible. I set the phone face down on my desk and called David. I told him not to communicate with Gavin about the bridge loan and not to reveal my role in the funding suspension. Instead, I wanted authority to compare every representation in the new application against the original Vanguard submissions, the recorded property data, and the personal guarantee documents already in the file. David understood immediately. He authorized the forensic review on behalf of the new executive leadership and instructed the Secure Records team to transmit the complete historical loan package to me. I locked my office door and watched the encrypted files populate one by one across my screen. Gavin believed he had forced me back into the position of a dependent wife. In reality, he had voluntarily delivered the first fresh piece of evidence into my hands. The high-interest loan he wanted me to co-sign was not going to rescue him. It had shown me where to look. I opened the oldest Vanguard application, placed the new bridge loan documents beside it, and began tracing every number that refused to match. My auditing firm was the perfect setting to dissect the financial ruin of the man I had married. Insulated from the street noise below, I focused entirely on the data files David had securely transmitted. I locked my door, poured black coffee, and began the forensic audit of Vanguard Horizon Partners and their specific disbursements to the development company of Gavin. Having spent 7 years untangling complex corporate accounts for multinational clients, dismantling the fragile accounting structure of a single real estate developer was going to be easy. What I found within the first 2 hours was not just simple mismanagement. It was a staggering, deeply reckless level of financial manipulation. Gavin had not just been stretching the truth to secure preliminary funding rounds. He had been creating absolute fiction. I pulled up the initial loan applications his firm had submitted to Vanguard 3 years ago. According to the spreadsheets, Gavin had wildly inflated the valuations of every single commercial property his family owned to serve as collateral. He appraised crumbling strip malls at triple their actual market value and claimed projected rental yields that were mathematically impossible. He had constructed a towering house of cards built entirely on falsified ledgers. The most devastating discovery was buried in the personal guarantee documents attached to the mezzanine debt. I clicked open a scan of the primary loan agreement, scrolling past pages of legal jargon until I reached the signature page. My breath caught in my throat. My hand suddenly started trembling. There, right beneath the sweeping signature of Gavin, was my own name. It was signed in blue ink, matching my typical handwriting with terrifying accuracy. Gavin had forged my signature. He had illegally bound me as a personal guarantor on a loan worth tens of millions of dollars, without breathing a single word about it to me. He had weaponized my pristine credit score to convince the private equity managers his chaotic venture was a safe bet. I leaned back in my chair, staring blankly at the glowing screen as a profound wave of betrayal washed over me. This was not a husband hiding a secret credit card. This was a man who had systematically positioned me to take the fall if his reckless ambitions crumbled. While he was mocking my career, he was secretly using my name to prop up his existence. The sheer audacity of his deceit extinguished any lingering hesitation I harbored about destroying his empire. I spent the next 3 hours compiling evidence, taking encrypted screenshots, and organizing the fraudulent loan applications into a devastatingly clear timeline. I sent the package directly to David with instructions to prepare the documents for immediate corporate deployment. By the time I stepped away from my desk to grab a late lunch, my mind was entirely devoid of mercy. I rode the elevator down to the sprawling marble-floored lobby of our building. It was a busy Wednesday afternoon. The vast atrium was crowded with my colleagues and visiting clients grabbing coffee. I was just reaching the security turnstiles when a shrill, piercing voice echoed across the room, cutting through the low murmur of professional conversations. I turned around to see Ashley marching through the glass doors. She wore designer sunglasses indoors, a massive handbag slung over her shoulder, and an expression of unadulterated rage. She spotted me near the security desk and charged across the lobby. She made sure she was loud enough for every single person in the atrium to hear her. "You are an absolutely pathetic, vindictive woman, Caitlin," Ashley screamed, her voice bouncing off the walls. Several of my coworkers stopped in their tracks and turned to watch the commotion. Ashley marched up to me, stopping inches from my face. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting calmly at my sides. "Gavin told us exactly what you are doing." She continued, waving her manicured finger in my face. "You are freezing his personal accounts and harassing him for ridiculous alimony because you cannot handle that he is leaving you behind. You are just a bitter auditor trying to squeeze money out of a successful developer because you know you will never amount to anything. You need to back off right now and let my brother run his company in peace." The lobby was entirely silent, except for the echoing voice of Ashley. I could see the shocked expressions on the faces of my colleagues as they watched a woman verbally assault one of their senior auditors in the middle of the workday. Ashley fed on the attention. She assumed causing a massive public scene would humiliate me into submission. She thought I would cower, apologize, and drag her away to a private corner to avoid the embarrassment. She had completely misunderstood who she was dealing with. I did not break eye contact or raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply let her scream. I let her exhaust herself, watching the flush of anger creep up her neck as she hurled insults about my blue-collar family and my desperate need for the wealth of her brother. She ranted about how their high-rise project was going to make them billionaires, and how I was a parasite trying to attach myself to their impending glory. After 2 full minutes of her screaming monologue, the building security guards finally intervened. 2 uniformed men approached quickly from the reception desk. One of them stepped between us, holding a firm hand up toward Ashley, politely but sternly instructing her that she needed to lower her voice or vacate the premises immediately. Ashley scoffed at the guard, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. She adjusted her handbag and glared at me with overwhelming contempt. "I hope you enjoy your pathetic little life, Caitlin." She spat out, her chest heaving from the exertion of her tantrum. "Because you are never getting another dime from my family." The security guards moved closer, preparing to physically escort her toward the doors. I raised my hand slightly, signaling the guards to wait for 1 second. I calmly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the paper of an envelope David had couriered to my office earlier that morning. I pulled the crisp envelope from my pocket. It bore the heavy embossed crest of the law firm representing the holding company. I held it out toward Ashley. Her eyes darted from the envelope to my face, a brief flicker of confusion breaking through her arrogant facade. "Take this!" I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence of the lobby like a blade of solid ice. She hesitated, her arrogance faltering under my unblinking stare. She snatched the envelope from my hand, gripping it tightly in her fist. "What is this?" she demanded, her tone suddenly losing a fraction of its venomous edge. "Another one of your pathetic demands for money. Give this to Gavin." I said, my voice steady, professional, and entirely ruthless. "It is an official notice of a mandatory shareholder meeting. Tell him to wear a nice suit. He is going to need it." I turned my back on her without waiting for a response and walked calmly toward the lobby cafe. I ordered a fresh cup of dark roast coffee and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip, leaving her standing completely bewildered in the massive lobby as the security guards finally escorted her out into the freezing wet and bitter cold street. The hot dark roast coffee warmed my hands as I sat at a small table in the corner of the lobby cafe. I watched through the massive glass windows as the security guards finally managed to push Ashley out onto the freezing wet Chicago pavement. She stumbled slightly in her designer heels, her face a mask of absolute outrage as the heavy doors locked behind her. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The woman who had spent years mocking my background and my career was standing in the freezing rain, unaware that the piece of paper clenched in her fist was the beginning of the end for her entire family. I finished my coffee, threw the empty cup into the trash, and rode the elevator back up to my quiet office. I sat down at my desk and immediately dialed the number of David. He answered on the second ring, his tone sharp and ready for business. I told him about the spectacular public meltdown of Ashley in the atrium. David chuckled softly, noting that arrogance was always the fastest route to a complete collapse. He then shifted to the financial updates. The suspension of the Vanguard funding had triggered exactly the catastrophic chain reaction we had anticipated. The development company of Gavin was bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate. The primary subcontractors had walked off the high-rise job site early that morning. The union foremen were threatening to file immediate liens against the property for unpaid wages. The city inspectors were already making inquiries about the sudden halt in construction. Gavin and Beatrice were currently in a state of absolute panic. They were scrambling to find a way out of the massive financial crater they had dug. David explained that his industry contacts informed him Gavin was actively shopping his toxic debt around the city. He was frantically pitching his high-rise project to any venture capitalist willing to take a meeting. He was desperate for a rapid bailout to save his reputation and keep his company out of immediate bankruptcy. This was the moment of vulnerability I had been waiting for. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the Chicago skyline outside my window. I instructed David to create a brand new, completely anonymous corporate entity by the end of the business day. I wanted a faceless private equity firm, with no visible ties to my mother or the holding company. We were going to throw Gavin a lifeline. We would approach him through an intermediary and offer to acquire his entire mountain of toxic debt. In exchange for this miraculous financial rescue, we would demand a massive controlling share of equity in his development company and absolute operational control over the high-rise project. Gavin was so deeply blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to maintain his high society image that he would sign anything to keep the project alive. He would think he was securing a brilliant multi-million-dollar buyout from elite investors. In reality, he would be eagerly handing the keys to his entire kingdom directly to me. David agreed to the strategy immediately. He utilized his extensive legal network to set the trap flawlessly. Within 48 hours, the intermediary had contacted the desperate development firm of Gavin. The bait was taken instantly. Gavin and Beatrice were so relieved to find a willing investor that they completely failed to conduct even a basic level of due diligence on the faceless firm offering the buyout. They were blinded by the promise of immediate cash and the desperate need to save their failing public image. They scheduled rapid negotiations, eager to sign whatever documents were placed in front of them to secure the capital needed to pay their furious subcontractors. The intermediary reported that Gavin was acting like a conquering hero during the meetings, completely oblivious to the restrictive clauses hidden deep within the buyout agreement. 3 days later, I was sitting across from David in his elegant downtown law office. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was a clear, brilliant blue, a sharp contrast to the dark storm that had raged during the funeral of my mother. We were reviewing the final acquisition documents before the official signing. The terms were brutally restrictive, granting the anonymous investor total authority over every single financial decision Gavin would make moving forward. Just as David was explaining the specific clauses regarding the transfer of equity, my personal cell phone buzzed loudly on the polished mahogany conference table. I glanced down at the screen. The notification displayed a text message from Gavin. I picked up the phone, my expression entirely neutral, and opened the message. Gavin had not sent a single word of apology for his horrific behavior at the house or his cruelty at the cemetery. He had not asked how I was coping with the loss of my mother. Instead, his message was a triumphant, venomous brag. It was a chaotic block of text dripping with unearned confidence and spite. I just secured a multi-million-dollar buyout from a major private equity firm, the text read. My high-rise project is fully funded, and my company is about to be worth billions. I told you that my networking at the gala would pay off while you were busy trying to ruin my image. You really thought freezing my accounts would break me. You are nothing but a bitter auditor. I am officially filing for divorce first thing tomorrow morning. I am making sure the lawyers expedite the process, so you will not see a single dime of my imminent wealth. Pack the rest of your cheap clothes and stay away from my house. I read the vicious words, slowly absorbing the absolute delusion of the man I had loved. He was so confident in his victory. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted me and secured his ultimate financial triumph. I placed the phone flat on the conference table and looked across at David. He raised a questioning eyebrow, pausing his review of the complex legal paperwork. I read the text message aloud to him, letting the arrogant words of my husband fill the law office. When I finished reading the final sentence about my imminent divorce and my supposed lack of wealth, David let out a low, deep chuckle. We shared a look of profound, undeniable satisfaction. The trap had not just been set. It had been eagerly sprung by the very person it was designed to catch. David reached across the wide mahogany table and slid the final binding page of the massive buyout agreement toward me. He uncapped a heavy silver fountain pen and placed it gently on top of the document. This is the master acquisition contract, Caitlin. He said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. The intermediary confirmed that Gavin and Beatrice have already signed their portions of the agreement across town. All that remains is the signature of the chief executive officer of the acquiring firm. I picked up the silver pen. I looked down at the signature line, feeling the immense weight of the legacy of my mother guiding my hand. I signed my name with sharp, deliberate strokes. I placed the pen back on the table. With that signature, I was no longer just a financially stranded wife. I legally owned the company of Gavin, and I held his entire future in the palm of my hand. The following morning, the final stage of my quiet revenge, moved directly into the heart of their empire. The gleaming glass-walled boardroom of the family firm occupied the penthouse level of a prestigious downtown high-rise. Gavin and Beatrice had turned the required emergency shareholder session into a highly publicized signing ceremony and press conference for the new investor, convinced the meeting would be a formality that celebrated their miraculous rescue. The panoramic views of the Chicago skyline served as a constant reminder of the wealth and status they worshipped. They had spared absolutely no expense for the occasion. The massive mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine, adorned with crystal water pitchers and expensive catered breakfast pastries. Every director and necessary shareholder representative was present because of the notice Ashley had carried from my office, but Gavin still believed the cameras were there to record his comeback. Beatrice, Gavin, and Ashley were dressed impeccably, completely masking the desperate financial panic that had consumed them only days earlier. Beatrice was wearing a tailored designer suit, her signature pearls resting perfectly against her collarbone. She was holding a crystal flute of champagne, boasting loudly to local business journalists about the unmatched resilience and generational legacy of her family. She claimed that true high net worth families always find a way to thrive, regardless of temporary economic downturns. Ashley, seemingly recovered from her embarrassing lobby tantrum days earlier, was wearing a sleek silk dress and nodding in agreement with her mother. Gavin was in his best custom tuxedo, playing the role of the visionary, untouchable developer. He was flashing his perfect smile for the cameras, shaking hands with his remaining board members, and acting as though he had single-handedly conquered the entire real estate market. They were basking in the warm, blinding glow of their fabricated success, utterly convinced they had outsmarted everyone. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom suddenly swung open. The low murmur of professional conversation and the clicking of camera shutters faltered as I walked into the room. I was flanked by David and two other senior corporate attorneys from the estate. I was not wearing the damp black morning clothes they had mercilessly mocked at the gala. I was dressed in a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit that projected absolute authority. My heels clicked with terrifying precision against the polished hardwood floor. The sudden entrance of four formidable legal professionals instantly shifted the energy in the room. The journalists lowered their notepads and recorders, sensing an unexpected, highly dramatic shift in the morning narrative. The air in the penthouse boardroom suddenly felt incredibly thin and suffocating. Beatrice spotted me first. Her perfectly practiced high society smile instantly morphed into a sneer of absolute disgust and irritation. She set her champagne flute down on the mahogany table with a sharp, echoing clink. She immediately attempted to control the narrative in front of the gathered press, seamlessly slipping into the role of the victimized matriarch. "What is the meaning of this?" Beatrice scoffed, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Security. I need security in the boardroom immediately. Please remove my hysterical soon-to-be ex-daughter-in-law from the premises. She has absolutely no business being here during a closed corporate event. She is clearly having a mental breakdown and trying to ruin the success of my son." Gavin stood up from his heavy leather chair at the head of the long table. His face flushed a dark, angry red as the cameras turned toward him. He marched toward me, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He yelled that I was completely embarrassing myself in front of his elite colleagues. He accused me of being a bitter, vindictive auditor who could not handle the fact that he was moving on to a life of unimaginable wealth and prestige without me. He demanded that I turn around and leave the building before he had me arrested and thrown in jail for trespassing on private corporate property. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the man who had abandoned me at the cemetery of my mother, the man who had drained my bank accounts and forged my signature, and I felt nothing but cold, absolute power. I remained perfectly silent, letting his furious words hang in the tense atmosphere. David, the senior corporate attorney, stepped forward. He completely ignored the furious ranting of Gavin. He did not even look at Beatrice. David calmly buttoned his suit jacket, walked confidently past the sputtering developer, and pulled back the heavy leather chair at the very head of the boardroom table. He turned toward me and respectfully deferred the seat of honor. I walked forward the room watching in stunned silence and sat down in the chair that Gavin had occupied just moments before. David turned to face the silenced room of journalists, board members, and my horrified in-laws. "I believe you all know our majority shareholder," David announced to the room, his voice echoing with devastating finality. The silence in the penthouse boardroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a catastrophic explosion. The business journalists who had been eagerly typing notes on their mobile devices just moments before froze with their hands hovering in mid-air. Every camera lens in the room was fixed directly on my face. Gavin stood frozen near the side of the long mahogany table. The triumphant smile he had worn since the morning had evaporated from his features. It was replaced by a look of sheer panic. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he struggled to process the devastating reality. He looked at David, then at the other corporate attorneys, standing behind me, and finally at me, sitting comfortably in his heavy leather executive chair. Beatrice had gone incredibly pale. The color drained from her face so quickly that her designer makeup looked like a painted mask resting on a ghost. She gripped the edge of the polished table, her knuckles turning stark white, her mouth opening and closing silently as she tried to formulate a response. She could not comprehend how the blue-collar hardware store daughter she so deeply despised was now sitting at the absolute head of her elite corporate empire. I let the silence stretch until it became unbearable for them. Then I nodded once to David. He placed a second folder in front of me, different from the audit packets waiting in his briefcase. This one contained the succession documents for my mother's holding company, the investment schedules showing its position inside Vanguard Horizon Partners, and the executed acquisition papers from the anonymous rescue entity Gavin had signed only days earlier. I slid the folder across the table toward Beatrice. She opened it with shaking fingers. Her eyes moved from the name of my mother to the capital schedules, then to the signature pages transferring controlling equity in the development company. The contempt on her face collapsed into disbelief. I watched her discover line by line that the fortune supporting the project she had used to humiliate my family had come from Linda all along. My mother's blue-collar hardware money sends her regards, I said. The sentence landed harder than any shout could have. Ashley stopped breathing for a moment. Beatrice stared at me as if the room had shifted beneath her chair. Gavin grabbed the folder from his mother and flipped through the pages too quickly, searching for some technical mistake that would restore the world he understood. There was none. The anonymous investor that had rescued his toxic debt was controlled by the same family fortune he had mocked at the cemetery. The capital he had spent years presenting as proof of his own superiority had been built by the woman whose funeral he could not be bothered to attend. His anger changed almost instantly. I watched it happen in real time. His shoulders dropped. His voice softened. He stepped around the table and tried to smile at me, the same polished expression he used with investors when he needed them to forget a broken promise. "Caitlin," he said, "we have both been under an incredible amount of pressure." He told me the last few days had gotten out of control and insisted that neither of us should make permanent decisions while emotions were high. Then he reached for my hand. I pulled it away before his fingers touched me. He kept talking anyway. He said that with my capital and his development experience, we could become the most powerful real estate couple in Chicago. We could put the divorce talk behind us, rebuild the company together, and in his words, rule the city. For a moment, I simply stared at him. This was for grocery money. The same man who had texted me that morning boasting that he was filing for divorce so I would never see a dime of his imminent wealth. He had not discovered love in the boardroom. He had discovered that I controlled the money. I leaned back in the chair and looked at him with the calmest expression I had worn all week. "We are not here to reconcile, Gavin," I said. "We are here to foreclose." His face went blank. I tapped the notice lying beside David's legal pad. It was a copy of the mandatory shareholder meeting notice Ashley had carried out of my office lobby. Gavin had treated it as another nuisance from a wife he believed powerless. After the rescue agreement was signed, his lawyers had folded the required emergency governance session into the same morning as the public signing ceremony, assuming the new investor would simply ratify the deal and praise his leadership for the cameras. That assumption was the reason every necessary director and shareholder representative was now in the room. I told him the meeting was proceeding exactly as noticed, except the agenda had changed. We would address control of the company, the immediate status of his executive authority, and the financial representations he had made to obtain the loans. Gavin backed away from me, finally understanding that the press conference he had staged as a victory celebration had become the venue for his own corporate reckoning. Beatrice whispered that this had to be illegal. David answered before I could. Every transfer document had been reviewed, every notice had been properly served, and every voting right attached to the acquisition had become effective when Gavin and Beatrice signed the rescue agreement. They had not been tricked into signing blank pages. They had been represented by counsel and had accepted the terms because they were desperate for cash. The problem was not that the agreement was hidden from them. The problem was that their arrogance convinced them they would never have to respect the person on the other side of it. I turned away from Gavin and faced the journalists again. The ownership question was finished. Now came the reason I had insisted the press remain in the room. Controlling the company was only one part of what the audit had uncovered. The much larger issue was how Gavin had obtained the money that kept the company alive before I ever assumed control. I rested my hand on the first forensic packet and nodded to David to distribute the evidence. I did not give them the opportunity to recover their composure or attempt to spin the narrative. I slowly unbuttoned my suit jacket and leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the polished wood. I looked directly at the row of journalists seated along the far wall of the boardroom. "Thank you all for joining us this morning," I said, my voice projecting clearly and confidently across the echoing room. "My name is Caitlin. As the Chief Executive Officer of the holding company that now legally owns this development firm, I feel it is my strict corporate responsibility to provide you with a fully transparent update regarding the true financial health of this organization." I gestured to David, who immediately opened his thick leather briefcase. He extracted a stack of pristine, heavy folders and began passing them down the length of the table toward the waiting reporters. Gavin lunged forward, his panic completely overriding his common sense. "You cannot distribute confidential company documents to the press," he shouted, his voice cracking with intense desperation. "This is a private corporate matter. You are violating strict non-disclosure agreements." David did not even look up as he handed out the final folder. "You no longer possess the executive authority to dictate corporate policy, Gavin," I replied calmly. "As the majority shareholder, I am initiating an immediate comprehensive restructuring of this firm, and the very first step of that restructuring is full transparency." The journalists eagerly opened the folders. Inside was the meticulous forensic audit I had compiled over the past few days. I explained to the silent room that the supposed high net worth empire of Gavin was entirely built on a foundation of gross financial manipulation. I directed the press to the second page of their packets, outlining how Gavin had wildly inflated the asset valuations of every single commercial property his family owned to secure his preliminary funding. I detailed how he had appraised crumbling vacant strip malls at triple their actual market value, creating a fraudulent illusion of massive generational wealth to lure in institutional investors. Gavin stood trembling, his hands gripping the back of an empty leather chair so tightly his fingers turned blue. "You are twisting the numbers," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the room as the cameras captured his collapse. "It is standard real estate projection. It is a common practice in commercial development. It is not common practice to commit blatant wire fraud." I countered, my voice hardening into a sharp, unforgiving edge. I instructed the journalists to turn to the final section of their packets. I watched as their eyes scanned the detailed pages, and I heard the collective intake of breath as they realized the sheer magnitude of the crimes committed. I explained that Gavin had not just manipulated commercial property values to look successful. He had deliberately forged signatures on multi-million-dollar personal guarantee documents attached to his mezzanine debt. I pointed to the specific page displaying the fraudulent signature. I told the room that my husband had maliciously weaponized my name and my pristine financial credit score to secure the massive loans, keeping his failing company afloat. He had illegally bound me to tens of millions of dollars in corporate debt without my knowledge. The room erupted into absolute chaos. The reporters began firing questions simultaneously, their voices overlapping as they realized they were sitting right in the middle of the biggest white-collar crime story of the year. The camera shutters began clicking frantically, the rapid blinding flashes bouncing off the glass walls of the penthouse. "Stop taking pictures!" Ashley suddenly screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. She pushed her way past a bewildered reporter, her face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You are making all of this up," she yelled, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "You are just a bitter, jealous woman trying to ruin us because you know you do not belong in our high society world. My brother is a visionary developer. I am calling our lawyers right now. We are going to sue you for defamation. We are going to take every dime you have and destroy your pathetic auditing career." I remained completely ice cold. I did not raise my voice or react to her frantic, desperate tantrum. I simply reached across the massive mahogany table and slid the undeniable audited proof of the forged loan documents directly toward the lead journalist from the City Business Journal. "The proof is right in front of you, Ashley," I said smoothly, never breaking eye contact with her. "You cannot sue someone for defamation when they are simply telling the documented truth." The cameras flashed again brilliantly, illuminating the absolute irreversible ruin of the family legacy they had worshipped for so long. The horrifying reality of the situation finally crashed down upon Beatrice. The impenetrable wall of her high society arrogance shattered completely. Her legs gave out and she sank heavily into a nearby leather chair, her purse dropping to the floor. She looked at the damning financial documents spread across the table, and then she looked at me. The condescending sneer she had worn since the day I met her was gone, replaced by the desperate, sobbing face of a woman who knew she was about to lose everything. She began to cry, her heavy tears ruining her flawless, pristine makeup. "Catelyn, please." Beatrice begged, her voice trembling and utterly pathetic as she reached a shaking hand out toward me across the table. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot take everything away. We are family. You have to show us some mercy. Please help us fix this. We can make it right." I looked down at the woman who had mercilessly mocked my mother while her casket was being lowered into the freezing mud. I looked her dead in the eye, my expression utterly devoid of sympathy or hesitation. I leaned forward slightly, resting my arms on the table, and echoed the exact words she had screamed at me over the telephone at the cemetery. "I would love to help Beatrice," I said, my voice perfectly clear, cold, and entirely unwavering. But I really have to put myself before your family." The words hung in the air, echoing off the glass walls of the penthouse boardroom. Beatrice stared at me, her mouth trembling, as the profound weight of my statement finally crushed the last remaining fragments of her high society pride. She slowly lowered her face into her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, silent sobs. The reporters did not look away. The camera shutters continued to click, documenting the exact moment. The untouchable matriarch realized her entire world had been completely dismantled by her own arrogance. Gavin stood frozen near the window, his chest heaving. He looked like a cornered animal frantically searching the room for an escape route that simply did not exist. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to issue another hollow threat, or to beg for a private negotiation. But the opportunity was ripped away from him before he could utter a single, solitary syllable. The heavy wooden doors at the very back of the boardroom swung open. The loud, authoritative click of the latch echoed through the silent room, causing every single head to turn toward the entrance. I sat back in the heavy leather executive chair and allowed a truly genuine, deeply satisfying smile to touch my lips. My father walked into the room. William was no longer the grieving, silent man standing in the freezing rain at the cemetery. I was no longer the humiliated father wearing a black mourning coat stained with cheap red wine from an arrogant sister-in-law. He walked tall, his shoulders squared, projecting a quiet, undeniable dignity that instantly commanded the respect of every person in the room. He wore a simple, clean suit, his weathered face set in lines of absolute granite. He did not look out of place in the very lavish penthouse. He looked like the only man in the room who actually knew the true value of hard work and completely honest integrity. I was absolutely not alone. Flanking him on either side were two tall, broad-shouldered men wearing sharp, unassuming gray suits. They moved with a synchronized, calculated efficiency that immediately identified them as law enforcement. They did not pause to admire the panoramic views of the Chicago skyline or the expensive mahogany table. They walked directly past the cluster of stunned business journalists and positioned themselves squarely between Gavin and the primary exit of the boardroom. Gavin took a sudden, panicked step backward. His expensive custom tuxedo suddenly looked like a costume he had completely outgrown. "What exactly is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking violently. "Who exactly let you into this building? This is a private corporate floor." One of the men in these gray suits reached into his inner jacket pocket. He withdrew a small black leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming silver badge. He held it up so the gathered press, the remaining board members, and my terrified husband could see it clearly. "We are federal investigators with the Financial Crimes Division." The man stated, his voice a low, booming baritone that left absolutely no room for argument or negotiation. "We are here executing a federal warrant regarding an ongoing investigation into massive commercial wire fraud, the deliberate falsification of corporate loan documents, and identity theft tied to your entire real estate development firm." The room erupted into a fresh wave of absolute chaos. The business journalists began frantically recording audio and typing notes. Realizing the story had just escalated from a massive corporate boardroom takeover to a high-profile federal criminal investigation, Beatrice let out a loud, piercing gasp and buried her face in the arms of Ashley, who was staring at the federal agents with wide, terrified eyes. Gavin looked around the room, his eyes darting wildly like a trapped rat. His breathing became shallow and rapid. The reality of his impending prison sentence crashed down upon him. He looked at the heavy glass entrance doors, then at the secondary exit near the catering spread. Instinct completely overrode all his logic. He lunged toward the side door, his polished dress shoes slipping slightly on the hardwood floor as he tried to bolt directly from the boardroom. I did not make it past the edge of the huge mahogany table. The second federal investigator moved with terrifying speed, stepping effortlessly into the path of my husband. He placed a large, very firm hand flat against the chest of Gavin, stopping his desperate escape attempt instantly. "You need to remain exactly where you are, sir," the investigator said calmly, not breaking a sweat as he easily overpowered the frantic developer. "Attempting to flee a federal inquiry will only result in immediate physical detainment. I highly suggest you sit down and cooperate." Gavin stumbled backward, running a shaking hand through his perfectly styled hair. He was completely trapped. His wealth was gone. His entire project was gone. His reputation was entirely ruined. He spun right around to face me, his face contorted into a mask of pure, completely unadulterated hatred. "You set me up!" Gavin screamed incredibly loudly, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You planned this entire thing. You fabricated those financial documents to frame me. You called the authorities. You are a psychotic, vindictive woman trying to destroy my life because you were jealous of my success." I did not raise my voice. I remained perfectly seated at the head of the boardroom table, my hands folded neatly on top of the audited financial packets. I looked at the man who had abandoned me at the cold grave of my mother, and I felt nothing but a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. "I did not set you up, Gavin," I replied, my voice echoing clearly across the tense boardroom. "I did not force you to wildly inflate the asset valuations of your commercial properties. I did not make you lie to your private equity investors about your projected rental yields. And I certainly did not hold a pen to your hand and force you to forge my signature on tens of millions of dollars of personal guarantee documents. Your arrogance, your greed, and your absolute desperation to maintain a fake, elite high society image did all of that. You built this massive house of cards entirely on your own. I merely reached out and turned on the lights so everyone else could finally see the truth." Gavin opened his mouth to argue, to hurl another toxic insult, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the journalists documenting his every frantic movement. He looked at the federal agents preparing to read him his rights. He finally looked at my father, who was standing quietly near the door, watching the downfall of the man who had treated his grieving daughter like garbage. The fight completely drained out of Gavin. He sank into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands as the true weight of his monumental failure finally crushed him. I picked up my briefcase. I placed it on the table and pulled out one final white folder. I stood up, smoothing the lines of my suit. I walked slowly down the length of the boardroom. I stopped right in front of Gavin. He raised his head, his eyes filled with despair. I dropped the folder directly onto his lap. "By the way, here are the divorce papers," I said smoothly. "Since you drained our joint accounts, the judge has already granted an emergency freeze on all your personal assets." Gavin stared down at the crisp white folder resting heavily on his lap. The bold black letters spelling out the legal petition for the dissolution of our marriage seemed to completely short-circuit his remaining cognitive functions. He did not reach for the file. He simply let his hands fall limply to his sides, his shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of his absolute irreversible defeat. The two federal investigators did not afford him any additional time to process the magnitude of his downfall. The taller agent stepped forward, his polished black shoes silent on the hardwood floor, and placed a firm, uncompromising hand on the shoulder of my husband. He instructed Gavin to stand up and place his hands behind his back. The sound of the heavy metal handcuffs clicking into place echoed with terrifying clarity across the quiet penthouse boardroom. It was a sharp clinical noise that finalized the destruction of the man I had once vowed to spend my life with. The journalists in the room scrambled to capture every single angle of the wealthy, arrogant developer being detained in his own custom-tailored tuxedo. Gavin did not fight them. He did not yell or threaten to sue anyone anymore. The fight had been entirely drained out of him. As the investigators escorted him toward the heavy glass doors, he refused to look at me. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, completely broken, a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of superiority, now reduced to a criminal suspect facing a massive federal indictment. I turned my attention away from the retreating back of Gavin and looked across the mahogany table at Beatrice and Ashley. They were standing close together near the catering spread, clutching each other as if the ground beneath their designer heels was physically shaking. The pristine, untouchable aura they had projected for decades had been utterly obliterated in a matter of minutes. They were stripped of their power, their luxury high-rise project, and the unearned social standing they had relentlessly lorded over me. They looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly terrified. I did not offer them a single word of parting advice or mock their profound despair. I simply picked up my briefcase, gave a brief nod of thanks to David and my legal team, and walked out of the boardroom. My father fell into step right beside me. We rode the elevator down to the lobby in a peaceful, profoundly satisfying silence. The fallout was incredibly swift and total. Before my father and I even made it back to the quiet suburbs, the story had completely saturated the local Chicago news networks. The major financial publications ran digital breaking news alerts detailing the shocking collapse of the elite real estate development firm. They published the precise details of the forged loan documents, the wildly inflated commercial asset valuations, and the dramatic federal raid that occurred right in the middle of a highly publicized corporate signing ceremony. The journalists did not hold back. They painted a devastating portrait of a greedy, desperate family willing to commit massive white-collar fraud to maintain their lavish, unsustainable lifestyle. Within hours of the story breaking, the elite social circles that Beatrice and Ashley so desperately clung to began severing ties with ruthless efficiency. The high society world is notoriously unforgiving to those who bring public scandal and criminal investigations into their pristine orbits. As the afternoon progressed, I sat in the modest living room of my father and watched the absolute destruction of their social empire unfold in real time. David called me with regular, highly entertaining updates regarding the collateral damage. The prestigious downtown country club, where Beatrice had proudly held a membership for over 20 years, acted immediately. The board of directors held an emergency unannounced telephone conference and voted unanimously to revoke her membership, citing a strict moral turpitude clause in their bylaws. When Beatrice attempted to seek refuge at the club later that afternoon, presumably to spin the narrative to her wealthy friends and garner sympathy, the security staff politely but firmly denied her entry at the front gates. They handed her a formal termination letter right through the window of her luxury vehicle and instructed her to turn around. Ashley faced a similarly brutal reality check. She had spent her entire morning boasting to her network of wealthy friends about the imminent billions her family was about to secure. By 3 in the afternoon, her mobile phone was ringing relentlessly, but not with messages of support or comfort. The incoming calls were from furious creditors. The emergency freeze I had placed on the personal assets of Gavin had triggered automatic reviews across their entire financial ecosystem. The credit card companies, noticing the federal fraud charges and the frozen accounts, began immediately suspending the massive lines of credit Ashley and Beatrice used to fund their designer wardrobes and luxury spa treatments. The boutique shops they frequented abruptly canceled their private shopping accounts. The people they thought were their loyal, devoted friends completely stopped answering their frantic text messages, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal. They were instantly transformed into social pariahs in the very city they had previously believed they ruled with absolute impunity. I closed my laptop and set it on the worn coffee table in the living room of my father. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the quiet suburban street outside. The relentless freezing rain that had plagued the city during the funeral of my mother had finally moved on, leaving behind a clear, remarkably crisp evening. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past few weeks finally begin to lift from my shoulders. The toxic, arrogant family that had spent years trying to make me feel small and insignificant had been completely neutralized by their own reckless greed. My father walked into the living room carrying 2 mugs of hot, dark roast coffee. He had changed out of his formal suit and was wearing a comfortable, worn flannel shirt. He handed me a mug and sat down in the armchair across from me. He looked at the closed laptop, then looked up at my face. The deep lines of sorrow and exhaustion that had aged him so severely over the past few days seemed to have softened considerably. He took a slow sip of his coffee and leaned back into the cushions. For the first time since we stood shivering in the mud beside the grave of my mother, my father actually smiled. It was not a wide, beaming grin, but a quiet, deeply genuine expression of profound peace and restored dignity. He looked around the modest living room, taking in the simple, sturdy furniture and the framed photographs of our family resting on the mantelpiece. He looked back at me, his eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering pride. "Your mother would be incredibly proud of you, Catelyn," he said, his voice thick with emotion but entirely steady. "She always knew you had the strength to handle whatever this world threw at you. You protected her legacy perfectly today." I smiled back at him, feeling a warm, comforting glow settle deep inside of my chest. Thank you for absolutely everything, Dad," I replied softly, holding the warm ceramic mug. "We protected it all together, but I knew the cleanup was really only just beginning for our new life." The next morning, I walked through the heavy glass doors of the corporate headquarters that formerly belonged to Gavin. The building was a monument to his vanity, filled with imported Italian marble and luxury fixtures. I walked directly past the stunned receptionist who recognized me from the news broadcasts the night before and took the private elevator straight up to the executive suite. I was there to assume total operational control of the stalled high-rise development project. I walked into the corner office that Gavin used to occupy. I set my briefcase down on his pristine glass desk, opened my laptop, and went straight to work. Using my expertise as a senior financial auditor, I spent the first 3 hours meticulously tearing through the internal human resources files and the executive payroll ledgers. What I uncovered was exactly what I had expected to find. Gavin had surrounded himself with a bloated, overpaid executive team composed entirely of his arrogant fraternity brothers and country club friends. They were pulling massive salaries while contributing nothing of actual value to the daily construction operations. They were simply draining the project funds to sustain their own lavish lifestyles. I drafted a comprehensive termination directive and summoned the entire executive leadership team into the main conference room just before noon. They walked in looking incredibly smug and defensive, wearing expensive suits, and glaring at me as if I were a temporary inconvenience they could intimidate. I stood at the head of the conference table and informed them that their services were no longer required, effective immediately. One of the vice presidents, a tall man who frequently golfed with Gavin, slammed his hand down on the table and laughed in my face. He told me I had no idea how to run a commercial real estate development and that firing them would completely destroy the project. I looked him dead in the eye and slid a stack of audited financial documents across the table. I told him that I knew exactly how he had been approving inflated invoices from shadow vendors to pad his own quarterly bonuses. I informed the entire room they had exactly 30 minutes to pack their personal belongings and vacate the premises, or I would hand my forensic audit over to the federal investigators currently building the fraud case against their former boss. The smug expressions vanished instantly. They packed their boxes and left the building in terrified silence. Cleaning house at the corporate level was only the first step. The real challenge was waiting for me at the actual construction site. By 2 in the afternoon, I arrived at the massive fenced-in dirt lot where the luxury high-rise was supposed to be built. The construction site was completely silent. The heavy machinery sat idle in the freezing mud, and the structural steel frames were exposed. Gavin had treated the blue-collar foremen and skilled trade workers like garbage, constantly delaying their payments while demanding impossible deadlines. Now, with the project frozen and the news of the federal raid dominating the headlines, the remaining loyalists and the few cronies Gavin had planted on the ground level were actively attempting to push back against my sudden takeover. They were spreading toxic rumors threatening to sabotage the construction schedules and walk off the job permanently if the new management did not meet their ridiculous inflated demands. I walked directly into the chaotic, muddy staging area, wearing my tailored suit and a bright white hard hat. I called an immediate site meeting gathering all the project managers, the union foremen, and the senior contractors around the large wooden drafting tables inside the temporary command trailer. The atmosphere inside the trailer was thick with hostility and deep suspicion. A burly, aggressive project manager, who had been a close personal friend of Gavin, crossed his arms over his chest and stepped forward, trying to physically intimidate me. He loudly declared that they were not going to take orders from an accountant who had never poured a single yard of concrete in her life. He threatened to shut down the entire operation and tie the holding company up in endless union litigation if I did not immediately approve the pending overtime invoices he had submitted. I did not back down. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the detailed project logistics reports I had spent the morning analyzing. I spread the documents out across the wooden drafting table so every single foreman in the room could see the numbers clearly. I looked directly at the hostile project manager and pointed to a specific line item on his invoice sheet. I calmly explained that he was currently attempting to charge the holding company for 300 tons of structural steel that had never actually been delivered to the site. I detailed the exact supply chain discrepancies, the false delivery dates, and the inflated material costs he had been using to siphon money out of the project budget. I demonstrated an unmatched razor-sharp knowledge of the complex financials and the intricate project logistics that left the man completely speechless. I turned my attention away from him and addressed the rest of the silent, watchful crew. I spoke to them not as an elite high society developer, but as the proud daughter of a woman who had run a blue-collar hardware store for 30 years. I told them that I understood the value of honest labor and the absolute necessity of reliable paychecks. I guaranteed them that every single legitimate back pay invoice would be processed and fully funded by the end of the business day. I promised them that the toxic, disrespectful culture Gavin had cultivated was permanently terminated and that moving forward this site would operate with total financial transparency and mutual respect. The hostile project manager silently packed up his gear and walked out of the trailer, knowing he had been completely defeated. The remaining foremen and contractors' men who had spent months dealing with the arrogant dismissal of Gavin looked at me with a newfound profound respect. I had earned their loyalty not through empty corporate promises, but by proving I possessed the competence and the absolute integrity to lead them. I returned to my quiet executive office later that evening, watching the city lights begin to sparkle against the darkening sky. I unrolled the massive blueprints for the high-rise across my glass desk. I stared at the designs of the sprawling penthouse suites, the private wine cellars, and the ultra-elite amenities Gavin and Beatrice had obsessed over for years. This building was meant to be their ultimate monument to extreme wealth. It was designed to keep the working class out and elevate their status. I realized in that moment that simply finishing the project as they had envisioned it would mean preserving their toxic legacy. I picked up my phone and dialed the lead architectural firm managing the design. When the senior architect answered, I told him to scrap the current blueprints. I informed him we were executing a massive structural pivot. Instead of an ultra-elite billionaire playground, we were redesigning the entire tower into a beautiful mixed-use development. We would feature affordable housing units for working families and dedicate the ground floor to accessible community spaces and small businesses. I was going to tear down their elitist vision completely and build a permanent testament to the true blue-collar roots they had so viciously mocked. 6 months later, the freezing winter rain that had defined the darkest days of my life had given way to a bright, clear Chicago spring. I walked up the wide stone steps of the downtown family court building with a sense of profound, unshakable calm. The endless, exhausting months of aggressive corporate restructuring and tedious legal maneuvering were finally culminating in this single morning. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and took my seat beside David at the polished plaintiff table. I wore a simple, elegant navy blue suit that I had purchased specifically for this occasion. The crisp lines and perfectly tailored fit gave me an added layer of confidence. I did not need to project the intimidating, ruthless corporate persona I had utilized in the boardroom. Today I was just a woman quietly closing a very painful chapter of her life. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and Gavin walked in with his defense attorney. The sight of my husband was genuinely shocking. The arrogant, untouchable real estate developer who had mercilessly mocked my grieving father was completely gone. In his place was a hollow, defeated man. Gavin wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit that hung loosely on his thinner frame. The emergency freeze I had placed on his personal assets, combined with the crushing weight of his mounting federal legal bills, had completely stripped him of his elite high society armor. There was no expensive luxury watch on his wrist. His hair was no longer perfectly styled. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped as he sank heavily into the wooden chair at the defense table. He did not even attempt to look in my direction. The looming federal criminal trial had entirely shattered his fragile ego. The presiding judge, a highly respected and remarkably stern woman with a well-documented reputation for absolutely zero tolerance regarding marital financial abuse, called the court to order. She peered over her reading glasses, flipping through the thick stack of financial audits and sworn depositions David had meticulously prepared over the last 6 months. The proceedings began smoothly, but it quickly became apparent that the defense attorney for Gavin was preparing for a desperate, last-minute offensive. The lawyer stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and attempted to launch a massive Hail Mary pass to salvage some fraction of the ruined livelihood of his client. "Your Honor," the defense attorney began, his voice projecting across the quiet courtroom, "we formally request an equitable division of marital assets that factors in the immense hidden wealth of the plaintiff. My client was deliberately and maliciously deceived throughout the entirety of his 5-year marriage. Catelyn intentionally concealed a massive commercial real estate fortune and a secretive holding company from her husband. She acted with profound financial deceit, hoarding generational wealth while watching my client struggle to finance his business ventures. We argue that this hidden estate should be considered marital property, and Gavin is legally entitled to half of the total assets to compensate for her prolonged financial fraud against him." Gavin finally lifted his head, staring at the judge with a look of desperate, pathetic hope. He genuinely believed that he could somehow manipulate the legal system into rewarding his toxic behavior. He thought he could extract millions of dollars from the very woman he had abandoned. I did not panic. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety. I simply turned my head and looked directly at David. My attorney calmly stood up, effortlessly projecting the quiet confidence of a man holding a winning hand. He did not raise his voice or engage in theatrical courtroom arguments. He simply picked up a single slender file folder and approached the bench. "Your Honor, the claims made by the defense are entirely baseless and chronologically impossible," David stated smoothly, handing the open folder to the judge. Catelyn did not hide marital assets. The wealth in question was held within a blind trust established by her late mother. As the documents before you clearly illustrate, my client had absolutely no executive control, no legal authority, and no financial access to those specific trust funds during the course of her marriage to the defendant. David turned to face Gavin, his expression hardening into cold professional contempt. The defense attorney seems to be conveniently ignoring the established timeline of events. Catelyn did not legally assume her role as the sole executor of the holding company until the morning of November 14th. That exact date is highly significant, Your Honor. That is the morning after Gavin told his grieving wife he was leaving her. It is the morning after he packed his bags, walked out of their home, and maliciously drained their joint bank accounts, leaving her with absolutely zero liquid cash. He filed for divorce and abandoned his marriage before she ever signed a single document assuming control of her inheritance. The defense cannot lay claim to assets that became available only after the defendant intentionally destroyed the marriage and committed documented financial abuse. The judge spent several long minutes reading through the certified timeline David had provided. She compared the timestamps on the malicious bank transfers Gavin had executed against the official corporate filings, making me the chief executive officer of the estate. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Gavin began to sweat, shifting uncomfortably in his hard wooden chair as he watched the judge slowly shake her head in profound disgust. She set the documents down and folded her hands together. She looked directly at Gavin, her expression entirely devoid of mercy. "Mr. Davis," she began, her voice ringing with sharp, unforgiving authority. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a blatant, repulsive display of financial malice and sheer entitlement. You drained the joint accounts of your wife while she was burying her mother. You abandoned your marriage and attempted to leave her completely destitute. And now, while you are currently under federal indictment for forging the signature of your wife on massive commercial loans, you have the absolute audacity to sit in my courtroom and demand half of her inheritance." Gavin opened his mouth to speak, but the judge immediately raised her hand, silencing him instantly. "The legal timeline is undeniable and completely irrefutable," she stated with absolute conviction. "The trust assets were secured after the functional dissolution of this marriage caused entirely by your own hostile actions. Therefore, they are entirely separate property, and they are completely protected from any marital division." She picked up her wooden gavel. "I am granting this divorce fully in favor of the plaintiff. Furthermore, considering your documented financial abuse, I am ordering you to immediately repay the entire sum of the joint funds you maliciously drained, plus the maximum allowable statutory interest. I am also ruling that you are entirely responsible for paying all of the legal fees incurred by your former wife during this proceeding." The gavel came down with a loud, echoing crack that sealed his fate forever. Gavin completely collapsed back into the hard wood of his chair. He slowly buried his face in his hands, trembling with the absolute realization of his new reality. He was not walking away with a multi-million-dollar settlement. He was walking out of that courtroom carrying a mountain of devastating debt, stripped of his business, his social status, and his dignity. He was left entirely destitute, and he was facing a federal prison sentence completely alone. A few weeks passed, and Chicago warmed steadily toward the beginning of summer. I had transitioned out of my life as a corporate auditor and stepped fully into my role as head of the holding company. I was actively directing the massive redesign of the downtown high-rise project. The steel skeleton that Gavin envisioned as a billionaire playground was being rapidly transformed into a mixed-use community development. I spent my mornings on the construction site, wearing a white hard hat and reviewing architectural blueprints with the union foreman who now treated me with respect. I was standing inside the command trailer that Tuesday morning, going over the installation schedule for the affordable housing units, when the lead site security guard knocked on the open door. He stepped inside looking slightly confused and informed me that there was a young woman waiting at the perimeter security gate. She was refusing to leave until she spoke with me directly. I asked for a name. The guard replied she said she was my sister-in-law. I set my blueprints down on the drafting table and made my way across the bustling construction site toward the chain-link perimeter. I expected to see another aggressive tantrum, perhaps another desperate attempt to scream at me in front of my employees. But the person standing on the other side of the security fence was almost entirely unrecognizable. It was Ashley, the woman who proudly paraded around the luxury gala in a stunning emerald green gown mocking my mourning clothes was completely gone. The arrogant socialite who stormed into the lobby of my auditing firm had vanished. In her place stood a frantic, disheveled, and profoundly broken young woman. She was wearing a faded trench coat that was clearly from several seasons ago. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot. The heavy designer makeup she usually wore was entirely absent, revealing deep dark circles under her eyes. She looked terrified, nervously twisting the strap of a cheap canvas handbag around her fingers. I signaled the security guard to open the perimeter gate. I walked out onto the concrete sidewalk and stood a few feet away from her. I did not cross my arms or try to intimidate her. I simply stood there waiting quietly for her to speak. Catelyn Ashley began, her voice trembling and lacking any of its former shrill hostility. Thank you for coming out here to see me. I know you have absolutely no reason to give me the time of day after everything that happened. I did not offer a polite smile or a word of comfort. You are right, Ashley. I replied, my tone perfectly even. I do not have a single reason. So please tell me why you are standing outside my construction site on a Tuesday morning. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the street before returning to my face. We lost absolutely everything. She admitted, the words spilling out of her mouth in a panicked breath. When the investigators froze the company accounts and the bank foreclosed on the suburban estate, my mother and I were left with nothing. The country club kicked us out. Our credit cards were canceled. Every single person we thought was our friend completely stopped returning our phone calls. We had to move into a tiny apartment way out in the suburbs just to avoid sleeping on the street. I listened to her recount the exact consequences I had orchestrated. I felt no pity. I simply nodded to indicate that I heard her. I do not know how to do anything, Caitlin. Ashley continued, tears welling up in her eyes and spilling over her pale cheeks. I spent my entire adult life going to charity luncheons and networking parties. I do not have a college degree. I do not have any actual job skills. I tried applying for a few office manager positions, but the moment they run a background check and see my last name tied to the federal wire fraud case of Gavin, they throw my resume in the trash. I am completely unemployable. She took a desperate step forward, reaching a shaking hand out toward me, as if she wanted to grab my arm. She stopped herself just before making contact, perhaps remembering the cold authority I had displayed in the boardroom. Please, Catelyn. She begged, her voice dropping to a pathetic whisper. I know you own the holding company now. I know you are in charge of this massive development project. You have hundreds of jobs available. I will do anything. I will answer phones. I will file paperwork. I just need a chance to earn a steady paycheck so my mother and I do not starve. We were almost sisters once. You know I can be a hard worker if you give me a chance. Please just show me a little bit of grace. I looked at the weeping woman standing in front of me. I looked at the hands that were currently begging for my financial mercy. I did not see a sister. I saw the exact same hands that had deliberately tilted a crystal glass of red wine forward, intentionally ruining the dark coat my grieving father owned just hours after he had buried his wife. I saw the woman who marched into the lobby of my previous employer and screamed at the top of her lungs, attempting to publicly humiliate me and destroy my career because she thought I was a bitter parasite. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream at her the way she had screamed at me. I did not hurl insults about her sudden lack of wealth or mock her cheap clothing. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a plain white business card. I held it out toward her. Ashley looked at the card, her eyes widening with a sudden desperate flare of hope. She thought I was handing her a direct line to my human resources department. She thought her pathetic performance had worked, and that I was going to secure her a comfortable desk job inside my corporate empire. She snatched the card from my hand and looked down at the printed text. Her face fell instantly. The hope completely vanished, replaced by devastating confusion. It was not a corporate contact card for the development project. It was the contact information for a local entry-level temporary employment agency that specialized in warehouse packing and manual data entry. You wanted to be a part of the real world, Ashley. I said, my voice echoing with a cold finality that left absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. Start at the bottom. It builds character. I watched Ashley stumble away down the cold concrete sidewalk, her faded trench coat disappearing into the bustling Chicago crowd. I did not feel a single trace of guilt or regret. The woman who had built her entire identity on stepping on the necks of working-class people was finally going to learn what an honest day of labor actually felt like. I turned my back on the busy street and walked purposefully into the busy command trailer. The heavy, detailed blueprints for the new mixed-use development were spread across the wooden drafting tables. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and initiated the final legal procedures I had been meticulously planning for months. I typed out the official corporate filing documents to legally dissolve the anonymous shell structure my mother had maintained for decades. It was time to bring her incredible legacy out of the shadows and into the bright light of day. I completely renamed the entire multi-billion-dollar enterprise. It officially and permanently became Linda Legacy Holdings. I wanted the name of the woman who had sold light bulbs and hammers to echo through the elite financial corridors of the city forever. I wanted the men in their expensive suits to have to write her name on their checks. Every single time a major real estate transaction was executed in this district, the legacy of my mother would be recognized and respected. Over the next several months, the massive steel skeleton that Gavin had intended to be an exclusive ultra-elite billionaire playground was completely transformed. My dedicated construction crews worked tirelessly, fueled by guaranteed fair wages, comprehensive health benefits, and a culture of absolute respect. We systematically stripped away the pretentious luxury wine cellars and the private rooftop helipads. In their place, we built beautiful, sustainable, and highly accessible affordable housing units designed specifically for the working families of Chicago. We dedicated the entire sprawling ground floor of the massive tower to accessible community centers, free after-school tutoring spaces, and heavily subsidized storefronts for local small business owners. When the stunning architectural renderings and our progressive corporate mission statement were finally released to the press, the public response was overwhelmingly positive. The local news networks and national business journals ran extensive glowing feature stories praising the radical pivot. They celebrated the project as a necessary, brilliant disruption of the toxic, greedy real estate market that had plagued the city for years. I was no longer just the silent auditor working in the background of a massive firm. I was officially recognized as a powerful visionary leader in the commercial real estate sector. I received prestigious invitations to speak at major urban development conferences, and top city officials actively sought my expert advice on future commercial zoning projects. But I knew that simply building one inclusive high-rise was not enough to dismantle the deep systemic elitism that men like my ex-husband relied upon to maintain their unearned power. I wanted to create a permanent, powerful pipeline of opportunity for people who actually deserved it. I called David and instructed him to allocate a very significant portion of our annual corporate profits to establish a comprehensive educational endowment. We created the Linda Hardware Memorial Scholarship. It was specifically designed to fully fund the entire college tuition, housing costs, and early career networking opportunities for young, ambitious women entering the highly competitive fields of corporate finance and urban development. I personally interviewed every single one of the scholarship candidates. I deliberately looked for the women who were currently working double shifts as waitresses just to pay rent. I looked for the women who were studying late into the night at public libraries, and the women who had the raw, undeniable intelligence to succeed, but completely lacked the elite family connections to get their foot in the door. I wanted to ensure that these brilliant, hardworking individuals had a clear, unobstructed path forward in their careers. I wanted to guarantee that they would never have to rely on toxic, arrogant gatekeepers or suffer the humiliating judgments of high society families just to build a successful career. They deserve to build their own legacy without compromising their integrity. I wanted them to know that their humble backgrounds were a source of profound strength, not a liability to be hidden away in shame. The grand opening of the Community Development Project fell on a bright, perfectly clear Saturday morning. The crisp morning air felt incredibly refreshing. The towering building stood as a gleaming, magnificent testament to resilience and honest labor against the blue sky. Hundreds of people gathered in the newly paved, beautifully landscaped plaza for the official ribbon-cutting ceremony. There were local politicians, enthusiastic community leaders, and the excited families who were moving into the beautiful new apartments. I stood on the raised wooden stage, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored navy blue suit. The applause from the massive crowd was absolutely deafening, a roaring wave of genuine appreciation that filled my chest with a profound sense of peace. I stepped down from the wooden podium after delivering my speech and made my way slowly through the cheering crowd, shaking hands and accepting warm embraces from the new tenants. Their joyful, smiling faces validated every single difficult decision I had made. I found my father waiting for me near the entrance of the main community center. William was wearing his best dark suit, his silver hair neatly combed. He looked around at the towering glass and steel structure, his eyes shining with an overwhelming fierce pride. He did not say a single word to me at first. He simply reached into his suit jacket pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He held it out to me. It was a thick square of polished glass framed in dark solid oak wood. Preserved perfectly inside the glass were two worn, scratched brass keys. They were the original keys to the hardware store of my mother. I took the heavy frame from his hands, feeling the cold glass against my palms. The metal felt like an anchor, connecting me directly to her memory. I looked down at the keys, the tangible proof of the endless hours of quiet, uncelebrated labor that had funded this entire multi-million-dollar skyline. I clearly remembered the familiar smell of fresh sawdust and paint from her small shop. I slowly looked back up at my father. He reached out and gently placed his rough, calloused hand over mine. "Never forget where we came from, Caitlin," he said, his voice incredibly thick with deep emotion, "because those simple keys unlocked the entire world, and we will keep building it together, honoring her every single day." I held the heavy wooden frame close to my chest, letting the deep truth of his words settle into my bones. The roaring applause from the community plaza seemed to fade into a quiet hum as I stood there with my father. We had faced the worst of high society greed and emerged completely uncompromised. The massive glass doors of the new community center opened, and my executive team stepped out to join us on the sidewalk. David gave me a warm, respectful nod, while the newly appointed scholarship directors excitedly discussed the first round of applicant interviews. I was surrounded by a chosen family of brilliant, fiercely loyal professionals who valued integrity above all else. They did not care about the clothes I wore or the prestigious clubs I belonged to. They respected my intellect, my work ethic, and the unyielding vision I had brought to life. A few weeks after the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the final echoes of justice rang through the Chicago financial district. The local news networks interrupted their regular morning broadcasts to announce the official conclusion of the federal investigation. I was sitting in my downtown office sipping dark roast coffee when the breaking news alert flashed across my computer screen. Gavin had officially accepted a comprehensive plea deal from the federal prosecutors. In a desperate attempt to avoid a public trial that would have exposed more of his catastrophic financial manipulations, he had pleaded guilty to multiple counts of commercial wire fraud and identity theft. The presiding federal judge showed zero leniency for a man who had built an empire on lies and forged signatures. Gavin received a multi-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The arrogant developer who had once screamed at me in a hotel hallway was now trading his custom-tailored tuxedos for a standard-issue prison uniform. His aggressive pursuit of an elite high society image had ultimately secured him nothing but a tiny concrete cell. The fallout for his mother was equally devastating and entirely self-inflicted. Beatrice had spent decades cultivating a pristine aura of immense generational wealth, looking down her nose at anyone she deemed unworthy of her presence. Now she was drowning under the crushing weight of astronomical legal bills and court-ordered financial restitutions. Without the stolen funds from the holding company, her entire world completely collapsed. The creditors she had dodged for months finally initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings. Beatrice was forced to sell her sprawling, meticulously decorated suburban estate just to keep herself out of a federal courtroom. The society friends she had hosted for lavish charity dinners completely abandoned her, treating her name like a toxic virus. With her bank accounts drained and her reputation in absolute ruins, Beatrice was forced to pack her remaining possessions and move into a tiny rented apartment far outside the city limits. She was entirely stripped of the power and the social standing she had used as a weapon against my mother. The utter destruction of their arrogant family dynamic stood in sharp, brilliant contrast to the beautiful reality I was building. While the family of my former husband fractured under the immense pressure of their own greed, my life expanded in ways I never could have imagined. I was no longer the quiet, accommodating auditor, trying to shrink myself to fit into a toxic marriage. My daily schedule was filled with meaningful collaborations, strategic planning sessions for affordable housing initiatives, and vibrant dinners with genuine friends. When my birthday arrived that year, I did not spend it sitting silently at an upscale restaurant, while snobby in-laws made passive-aggressive comments about my career. Instead, I hosted a joyful dinner party at my own home. My father sat at the head of the table laughing openly and sharing stories with David and the senior foreman. We raised our glasses, not to toast empty corporate profits or fake social status, but to celebrate resilience, honest labor, and the absolute power of standing your ground. The evening before the first major wave of commercial tenants officially moved into the renovated high-rise, I decided to visit the site one last time while it was still quiet. I drove downtown just as the sun was beginning to set over Lake Michigan. The security guards waved me through the perimeter gates with warm, familiar smiles. I walked into the massive, gleaming lobby, my heels clicking softly against the polished stone floors. The space was completely transformed from the muddy, chaotic staging area where I had confronted the hostile project manager months ago. The walls were decorated with beautiful murals painted by local community artists, and the expansive windows let in the fading golden light of the evening. I bypassed the main community spaces and walked over to the private executive elevator. I rode it all the way up to the highest floor of the building. I stepped out onto the sprawling outdoor observation deck. The cold wind whipped my hair around my face, but I did not feel the freezing chill. I walked right up to the edge of the glass railing and looked out over the breathtaking illuminated Chicago skyline. The city stretched out before me, an endless ocean of glittering lights and towering steel structures. I placed my hands flat against the cool glass and took a deep, steadying breath. I thought back to that terrible, freezing afternoon at the cemetery. I remembered the heavy, suffocating grief of burying my mother and the sheer blinding shock of hearing my husband demand that I put his networking event before my own family. I remembered the profound humiliation of standing in the lobby of my auditing firm, while Ashley screamed insults at me, and the terrifying, uncertain moment when I discovered the forged personal guarantee documents. I had lived through 24 hours that broke my entire life apart. I had lost the man I thought I loved, the marriage I thought was secure, and the illusion of the future I thought we were building together. But standing on top of the magnificent tower my resilience had built, I finally understood the profound truth of my journey. That terrible day was not the end of my life. It was the exact necessary catalyst I needed to tear down a fragile, toxic facade. The betrayal had forced me to dig deep into the bedrock of my own character and discover the immense strength my mother had quietly passed down to me. I had lost a crumbling marriage, but I had gained absolute, uncompromised freedom. I looked out over the beautiful city one last time, knowing that the foundation I had built was finally strong enough to hold the weight of my own incredible legacy. The crisp morning air filled my lungs as I stepped out of the truck of my father. Exactly 1 year had passed since the devastating afternoon we stood in the freezing rain to bury my mother. I looked up at the sky. It was a brilliant, unbroken expanse of bright blue, entirely devoid of the heavy gray storm clouds that had mirrored my profound grief 12 months ago. The autumn breeze carried the fresh, earthy scent of fallen leaves instead of the bitter sting of winter rain. I zipped up my warm wool coat and fell into step beside William. We walked together down the quiet, winding stone path of the cemetery. The atmosphere was completely different today. There were no arrogant in-laws standing in the background whispering cruel judgments about our working-class roots. There were no toxic demands hanging over my head. My coat pocket was wonderfully, beautifully silent. There was no aggressive, upbeat ringtone waiting to shatter the sanctity of my morning. There was no arrogant, entitled husband calling to scream at me and demand that I abandon my grieving family to manage a high-society catering staff. Gavin was sitting in a federal prison cell entirely stripped of his phone, his tailored suits, and his fabricated wealth. Beatrice and Ashley were completely banished from the elite social circles they had worshipped, forced to navigate the harsh realities of the actual world they had spent decades mocking. The suffocating noise of their immense greed had been permanently muted. In their absence, I had finally found an absolute, unshakable peace that I truly deserved. My father walked with a steady, relaxed gait. The deep, heavy lines of stress that had aged his face so severely over the past year had softened into a gentle, contented expression. We reached the familiar grassy hill and approached the simple, elegant granite headstone marking the resting place of my mother. I knelt down on the soft, dry grass. I had brought a massive, beautiful bouquet of vibrant yellow sunflowers and deep red roses. They were her favorite colors, bright and resilient. I carefully arranged the fresh flowers at the base of the polished granite marker, making absolutely sure the delicate bright blooms rested perfectly against the beautifully engraved letters of her name. I ran my fingers lightly over the cold, smooth stone, taking a moment to appreciate the profound quiet. "We did it, Mom," I whispered softly, the crisp wind carrying my words across the quiet green lawn. "We completely finished the massive downtown development project just like we promised. It officially opened its doors last month to incredible public praise." I took a deep, grounding breath, letting the immense satisfaction of that accomplishment fill my chest now. I told her all about the towering building that now stood proudly in the center of the city. I described the beautiful, affordable housing units that were now filled with hardworking, deserving families. I told her about the bustling community center on the ground floor, where local children were receiving free after-school tutoring. I explained how we had permanently dismantled the elitist exclusionary vision of Gavin and replaced it with a project that actually served the people of Chicago. I told her that her anonymous holding company was no longer a secret. It proudly bore her name, standing as a massive, unyielding monument to her decades of quiet, brilliant labor. I also told her about the newly established Educational Scholarship Fund. I shared stories about the incredible, ambitious young women we had recently interviewed. I told her how her hard-earned wealth was now directly paying for their college tuition, ensuring they would never have to rely on arrogant, toxic gatekeepers to build their own successful careers in the financial sector. I sat back on my heels and looked at my father. William was quietly watching me with a soft, incredibly proud smile resting on his weathered face. He did not need to say anything. The profound, unconditional love and mutual respect flowing between us was absolute. I had spent the first 33 years of my life trying to shrink myself to fit into a mold created by people who fundamentally despised me. I had allowed Gavin and his cruel, manipulative family to completely dictate my self-worth, my personal confidence, and my boundaries. I had silently tolerated their endless escalating emotional abuse because I incorrectly believed that keeping the peace was more important than protecting my own dignity. But the agonizing heartbreak of losing my mother had shattered that toxic illusion forever. In the intense, fiery crucible of the past 12 months, I had completely reclaimed my entire existence. I had taken back control of my stolen finances, rebuilt my professional career on my own terms, and restored the profound dignity that had been maliciously stripped away from me. I slowly stood up and brushed the stray blades of dry grass from the knees of my dark slacks. My father reached out and gently rested his large, incredibly warm hand on my right shoulder. He gave my shoulder a firm, profoundly reassuring squeeze that communicated everything words could not express. "You honored her perfectly, Caitlin," he said, his voice rich with deep, unwavering affection. "She knew you had the strength to carry the weight of her legacy. She just needed you to finally see that immense strength for yourself." I smiled at him, feeling a sudden, overwhelming wave of pure gratitude wash over my heart. I reached out and securely linked my arm through his. We turned away from this granite headstone and began walking slowly back up the winding stone path toward his parked truck. I looked out past the tall wrought iron gates of the quiet, beautiful cemetery. In the far distance, soaring majestically against the bright, clear blue sky, the massive, gleaming skyline of Chicago loomed beautifully over the horizon. I could clearly see the distinct towering shape of the newly completed community high-rise project standing proudly among the other skyscrapers. It was a permanent physical testament to the incredible journey of the past year. Gavin had spent his entire life desperately shouting about his wealth, demanding constant attention and aggressively destroying anyone who threatened his fragile ego. He believed that true power required cruelty and loud public dominance. But as I walked arm in arm with my proud father toward our peaceful future, I knew the absolute truth. I had completely dismantled a toxic multi-million-dollar empire without ever once raising my voice in that corporate boardroom. I had proven that true, authentic power does not ever need to shout to be heard. The absolute sweetest, most devastating revenge in this world is simply a life incredibly well lived. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones who bleed you dry. We spend years shrinking ourselves to fit into the spaces they leave for us, believing that if we just work a little harder or stay a little quieter, we will finally be enough. But true power does not come from earning the approval of those who are committed to misunderstanding you. It comes from realizing you never needed their validation in the first place. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. Stepping away from toxic family members is not an act of betrayal. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You are absolutely allowed to protect your peace, rebuild your life on your own terms, and leave the architects of your pain completely behind. I would love to know if you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your future. Tell me how you found the courage to finally draw that line. Please share your journey in the comments below, because your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this message resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power.